In Spider-Man Web of Shadows, I worked on some of the open city events, which were just self-contained scripts to spawn and track enemies and objectives. I also owned both Black Cat fights and took over the Symbiote Wolverine fight when it needed improvement. Here, the story called for a Black Cat boss fight with her flirting you up, so I scouted out some locations near where the previous mission ended and picked a sequence of the more interesting rooftops in the area. I wanted to keep the fight to rooftops since many of the basic encounters happened at street level. My approach to bosses back then was to follow the trope of 3 phases of escalating complexity, so I started the fight with Black Cat and a minion on a simple rooftop. At health checkpoints, I used a quick cutscene to reset the locale since fights could roam unpredictably in the open city. This also let me set up something our creative director was pushing as part of our momentum combat. I would place minions in a path from one area to the next, temporarily disable them, then force the player to target the closest of them. This allowed a player to bounce from enemy to enemy. If they did it quickly and correctly, they got to instantly one-shot all of the minions while closing in on the boss. But if they failed to land a hit in time, then the minions would become active participants in the fight. I scripted the banter between Spidey and Cat, with a main conversation happening at the start of each phase, then additional context-driven lines triggered by either side landing hits. Her health was tuned so the majority of players would hear most of the lines. The Phase 3 transition featured more vertical movement to a canyon-like area, allowing for more chances of wall combat, and added a couple of the tougher minions to the fight. But since they could be killed with the bounce chain, I also turned up Black Cat's rate of counterattacks, making the common tactic of repeatedly web-pulling to her more dangerous. Due to time constraints, the Symbiote Wolverine fight was left in a simple state where you would beat up on a small group of symbiotes, then he turned, and would counter all of your attacks until you rang the bell, at which point you would just beat on him until his health bar ran out. I jumped in and updated the fight to something that fit the story and made the boss fight more than a single note. I added the siege to the beginning with a script which dynamically spawned waves of symbiotes based on your difficulty setting. Easier settings had smaller waves with less complex enemies, while harder settings had larger waves, a higher enemy count to complete, as well as introduced larger enemies which acted as enforcers to keep you off the smaller symbiotes. New waves would be spawned when a minimum threshold of enemies was reached. There was a complication of not having any appropriate objects the symbiotes could target to attack the church, so I set up a scripted behavior for them when they hadn't been hit or stunned recently to go to the nearest of the windows that I'd set up and play their ground pound taunt animation. Then periodically the behavior would damage an object I'd put inside the geometry, which is how the church window health indicators would pop up. For the fight with Symbiote Wolverine, you guessed it, 3 phases. Phase 1 was basic Symbiote Wolverine. He was given an array of melee attacks and occasionally block or countered. The bell could also be used to stun him, but since most players fought on the ground, they didn't generally think to swing up to the steeple to use it. Here's a bug. The player should have been kept somewhere off camera for this cutscene. It would have been 3 simple lines to save their position, put them elsewhere, and return them at the end. But since many of our cutscenes grabbed the player model, and this only would happen if you were near the pod when Wolverine reached it, I ended up letting this one slip through. Phase 2. Wolvie gains armor by absorbing a nearby symbiote pod. The armor added extra effective health, and while it was active, he could not be interrupted by some hit reacts. His block and counter rates also went up. This was an ideal time to ring the bell while fighting him, since that would still stun him. Since the armor came from a symbiote pod, I had originally set up multiple pods in the area so the player would need to clean them up to prevent him from gaining more armor. But this caused the fight to drag on, so I ended up only allowing him to use it once. Phase 3, he destroys the bell with a QuickTime event, and the fight finishes with turned up attack and counter rates and no gimmick to stun your enemies. The designer who originally worked on this fight, as well as myself, were fans of the Marvel vs. Capcom arcade game, so while designing Wolverine's attacks, we really wanted his Berserker Barrage. Unfortunately, the move did not translate well into this fight, and him yelling, "Berserker Barrage!" was precluded by our combat banter.